So throughout my career, I've been torn between hours and using story points, and I've always wondered why, as an industry, do we use story points? And I've always wanted to hear what the actual genesis story is. Where did story points begin, and what was the reasoning behind it? Because that could give us some insight into how it's evolved to what it is today. So lucky enough, I was able to get in contact with one of the gentlemen, Ron Jeffries, one of the co-founders of XP, who was involved in that team that it sort of invented story points, and to listen to his story, I find absolutely fascinating and intriguing to get behind the intent of why they actually started story points and how it's evolved over time into what it is today. So here it is, straight from the horse's mouth, Mr. Ron Jeffries.
What was your original motivation to use story points?
Well, I don't promise to tell the story the same way because there's no reason to do that, but it's worth noting that the first XP project, C3, started with a large-scale estimate. As it happened, we had a complete set of stories for the whole product because it was a payroll and we thought we knew everything that had to be done. And we actually spent just a few days estimating something like 400 stories.
Wow.
And we estimated them all in terms of, if I recall correctly, the number of weeks we thought it would take to do that one. And it was usually, 1, 2, 3 weeks, or whatever it was. And then we actually divided the team into 2 groups and estimated each half, and then we traded cards and updated and came up with estimates on how long we thought it would take. So it was the product began with estimation at a big scale. In the iteration in XP, the job of the development team is to look at all the stories that are available to be done, the high priority ones, here they are, lots of them, and to choose as many as they think they can do. This many, we can do this many, and do them. Now again, we would focus much more on on problems and less on solutions today, but that's what we did. And in case of payroll, we knew exactly what each one was anyway. And so you have this need to say, well, there's 1,000 stories or a million stories. How many can we do this week? And what we took to doing, and I don't remember quite why, was we started taking each story as it was brought to us in the planning, and we would associate it with what we called ideal days.
Mm.
We would say, how many ideal days would it take me to code this? And very quickly, since we were in this product, we knew how long, we had a good sense for how hard they were to do. And an ideal day to us was a day when they left us alone, didn't cost any meetings. Nobody, whoever was working on it wasn't sick. It was a perfect day. The manager never showed up. That's sort of an ideal day. And because every programmer has that sense, every programmer wants to say, if you bastards would leave me alone, I could do that in 2 days.
Yeah.
And they never do leave you alone, but they want to say that. So we used those ideal days, and then we tracked how many ideal days worth of work we got done in 2 weeks, or 3 weeks. Actually, for a long time we were doing 3-week iterations. How slow we were back then. So we would count how many ideal days we got in 15 real days, times the number of programmers. Well, it turns out it takes about 2 or 3 real days to get an ideal day. Because of all the friction that goes on in the work, and probably because of some innate bias in your estimation where you think in 2 perfect days I could do this, and it would take 3 days anyway, because you're too optimistic, whatever. And so basically there was like a ratio of 3 between the days we said we could estimate and the days we took to get things done. And that was very confusing to management, particularly to the ones who would only come by every now and again. They would say, well, you said this was going to take 3 days and it took 10 days. You said this was going to take 3 days and it took 7 days. You said, what's wrong with your estimation? They kept asking. So our response to that was we started calling them points.
Mm.
And then it was easy to say, it takes about 3 days to do a point. There's a 3-point story, it's going to take about 9 days. It was the same number to the programmers. We just named it points. And well, then we would add up the points on the stories, and we would say, well, we're doing about 30 or however many we were doing. But this week, Chet's on vacation, and we got that big meeting, so let's take 25, and we take 25, and it would be pretty close. So the story point really started just to obfuscate this relationship between a made-up number, the ideal days, and the actual elapsed time.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Now, and they worked fine for us. They worked just fine. Somewhere right along there, either I came up with the saying, you could call them gummy bears and it would work, or Joseph Pellrine came up with the saying, you could call it gummy bears and it would work. I don't know which. I think it was Joseph, but it might have been me. Because it's a number. You could call it a point, you could call it anything. The thing is this: as soon as you make the relationship between points and time, and that is what it was for, will come to be a manager in the room who says, these 25 points should have taken you 10 days, and they took 13 days. What's wrong with your estimation?
Mm.
And that's a complete rat hole. It's irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because what you're really trying to do is choose how much work to work on, and you get very good at that. And you can do it without putting points on things. You can do it by just looking at the stories and saying, well, that's going to take a while. I think we can do this much. And somebody else will say, I think we can do a little more than that. Let's take one more. We take one more. And nobody cares, because if you don't get it done this week, you'll get it done next week. Because that's what you really ought to be doing, is behaving adaptively as you go forward. You will discover that some of the things you thought were easy are difficult. You will discover that some of the things you thought were difficult were easy. It's always silly to imagine that you're going to know at the beginning of something everything you're going to know at the end. If a team was actually estimating perfectly and getting done on the clock every time,
yeah,
something's wrong.
Totally wrong.
Something is going wrong. Probably they are sandbagging.
Yeah.
If they're not sandbagging, they're certainly not working at the edge of their ability. Because if you work at the edge of your ability, sometimes you fall off the edge. And you say, "Oh, that didn't work. You have to do it again."
Yeah.
So that whole notion, even the ideal days, which we intended to be an internal measure that we, the team, would just use. We would just talk about it. We'd say, I can do that in 2 damn days, I got 3 days. I can do that 1 day. And we just would say, okay, and we'd use that and figure out how many stories we were going to do. And it was going to be a chat between us. But as soon as that bubbled up to some management level, it became a measure. And then it became a target. And it's like, no, the target ought to be the software. It ought to be, let's look at the software. So that is why I have looked favorably on the no estimates movement, if it's a movement, or noise, if it's noise.
Yeah. Because
I think at the scale of what you do this week, which is where story points really came from, you don't need it. You want to just cut your stories down so they're all about the same size, like a day. That's generally always possible. And count how many you're getting done. Hey, we're getting about 20 stories done a week. Good. That's, makes sense. 2 weeks later, you're getting like 17 stories. You start thinking, what's happening? Are we slowing down, or are the stories changed?
Yeah.
You trigger the team to look back and say, what's going on? And you figure it out. And you say, well, what's going on is we're having too many bugs to fix. Because we don't get story points for bugs because we already got the points for that one. I don't think we've been refactoring enough, and that whole area with the database is getting really hard to work with, and it slows us down.
Yeah,
so you use
that's going up.
a flow to trigger a retrospective, to trigger an inspection. But you don't treat it as a target, because if you treat it as a target, you will meet it. any sensible team will meet a target like that by scaling their work to fit the target. And that's not what you want.
Mm.
Now that, of course, leaves open the larger question of, okay, fine, but how did you know whether you could get the payroll done in the year they were giving you to do it?
Mm.
And the bigger estimation that we did there, and how do you really ever do that? I would mostly want to not do that, and I certainly want to not answer that question because I don't really know the answer to that question, but I do know two resources. If you want to do it the hard way, you read Steve McConnell's books on estimation, and he's got every estimation technique you could possibly ever want to have. And you could study that and use any of them because they're as good as anything else. They won't be accurate, but there is no accurate way to predict the future. If we could predict the future, we would all be driving expensive cars. And George Dinwiddie, Dinwiddie, has a brand new book on estimation that just came out. And it's very interesting because it looks at estimation from an agile angle. And so I would say, look at those, read those, and see what you think about estimation. But for most projects, I would concern myself with flow and not with estimates and actuals.
Mm. It's great to hear the genesis story of how it began